Hello, everyone. Oh, it's good to see you all. I've been sitting amongst you now for the past while, and I've been like, okay, I'm nearly there. Wednesday afternoon, nearly there. But I'm here, so great. Thanks. Thanks. Good to be here. So my name is Jeff Simons, and I am talking about navigating environments of complexity and transformation, and how you as designers can become more effective agents of change. So a little bit about me. Might hear from my accent that I'm a little bit weird sounding, and that's because I'm from The Hague, the Netherlands, so a tiny country in Europe. And a few years ago, about a decade ago now, actually, at this stage, I moved to Ireland. So I moved from the big city to the countryside, amongst the greenery and the mountains and all that. So I lived there together with my wife and our two doggies. And over the course of my career, I sort of have fallen in love with designing for an enterprise context, sort of for B2B experiences, that kind of thing. And so over the past 15 years or so, I've worked at a mix of both in-house product teams and consultancies doing just that. So I currently work as a director of product design at this company called Charles River Laboratories. So Charles River Labs is a contract research organization. And essentially what that means is that it's an organization that helps companies develop drugs and medical therapeutics for all kinds of organizations worldwide. So it can be from things like vaccines to cancer medication to even something as simple as Tylenol, right? So really everything across that spectrum. So it's quite a large company, consisting of about 20,000 people or so worldwide. I'm part of the very humble, comparatively, 20-person design team, but we're small but mighty, and who in turn are part of the global technology group, who is essentially helping the company embark on the digital transformation that the company basically embarked on a couple of years ago. So the thing with the likes of digital transformations is that they're all about change, right? And so I'd like to talk a little bit about change itself and what we can learn from that as designers. So you may be familiar with this this quote. The only constant is change, from a Greek philosopher gentleman whose name I will not dare to butcher live on stage in front of an audience. But it's probably fair to say that for a lot of us, change has been fairly abundant. We've seen quite a lot of change these past 2-3 years, right? So it's everything from pandemics and wars, civil unrest, foods and goods shortages, to within our own industry, in our hiring markets, incredible ups and some recent incredible lows, which we've heard some speakers talk about as well. Now the thing is, you might look at this and say, like, okay, but apart from the hiring market thing, like how does that affect me as a designer day to day? And while the majority, hopefully, doesn't, with the exception of the pandemic, the reality is that for a lot of that stuff that's market related, that does have an effect on our employers, which in turn has an effect on us. It's things like breaking into new markets, going deeper into existing markets, spin-offs, layoffs, mergers, acquisitions, the whole lot. Like all of that has an effect on the mandate that we're given as designers and the product teams that we're part of to act on all of that change. Companies are essentially forced to reinvent themselves constantly, and we're experiencing this cascade of change, right? The things we're seeing on a larger level make its way all the way down to us, mere cogs in the machine that is working for companies on the smaller level. So, but the thing is, I don't know about you, but I've gotten to a stage where I'm actually exhausted. I'm exhausted of all the change. Does anyone else feel this way? Yeah? Right. Well, you're not alone, right? There's us together that have become exhausted of all this change. Burnout is probably more prevalent than ever before, right? And so it's not uncommon that you feel this way. People have spent the past few years honing their crafts, only to decide to upend their lives and essentially, abandon being a designer and becoming flower farmers, or like opening coffee shops, or picking up trades like carpentry or plumbing, right? Things that have nothing to do with making software, and actually, it sounds kind of nice, actually, to a certain degree. And I have a theory that, while I'm sure there's many reasons why people choose to make a decision like that, I have a theory that has to do because people feel like they have less and less control over the outcome of the work that they do on a daily basis, right? It's things like decisions on our work that are seemingly coming from some random person in the company somewhere, or like your stakeholders that are more enamored with their own ideas as opposed to the research that you're presenting to them. Or it's like system dependencies upon system dependencies, legacy software. I feel quite passionate about this. That are ultimately determining the ultimate user experience that you design. And no matter how lovely it is in Figma, ultimately it might feel disjointed and unrefined because of all of those layers of complexity, right? So in other words, these are the kind of things that make you feel like you have no control over the output of the work you're doing, right? It doesn't matter how hard you work, because with all this complexity, it makes you essentially feel like you have no control. And that just happens to be one of the primary drivers of burnout. Now, if you felt like that recently, and you're a designer in a mid to large enterprise company, which I think a lot of you are, by the sounds of it, and by speaking to a few of you this week, then part of the outcome of today's talk is to give you some tools and ideas on how to approach change and give you back a bit of control, right? So to basically make some of those uncontrollables that we spoken about earlier into more controllables. And while it certainly mightn't be the silver bullet to cure your feelings of overwhelm or burnout, I'm not, I'm not doing that with my humble presentation. I hope that it gives you some ideas on how to make, some of those things feel more controllable. So to start with the end, here's what you can expect to learn from my talk today. So the main theme of this talk is that I feel that you have all the tools you need to bring about the change that you're hoping to make as a designer, right? But you just got to use them a little bit differently. The ways you're going to do that are in three ways. That's what I'm going to talk about. First is map and explore. Use what you know to better understand your organization. The second is speak the language, so translate what you know in the right language that better resonates with people. And the third is don't go at it alone, right? So bring people together in these communities of change. But before we dive a little bit deeper into that, let's take a look at some of the examples of the types of change, right? Because change, as I've just mentioned, can be on a whole different layers of abstraction. So like, what are we talking about? So in essence, the change I'm referencing is as simple as going from a current state to a future state. And I've listed a few different examples here. And when you take the time to read through these, you'll notice that in each and every one of these changes, whether they're big or small, they have a component that requires collaboration with other people. So it's not as simple as, diving into Figma and making a small change that ultimately you're fairly well positioned to do and to make. But it's things that require you to collaborate, to negotiate. And so that's the hard change to do, right? Because that requires working with other people. So let's dive into how you can do that a little bit more effectively. So I'd like to introduce you to this guy called John Kotter, who about 25 to 30 years ago wrote this book called Leading Change. As a matter of fact, it was 1996 when he first published this book. And it laid out a set of 4 principles and an 8-step approach to help affect change for leaders looking to make a change in their organization. So these principles and this has essentially been a foundational approach to a practice called change management, a profession that's a really interesting profession, which you may have heard about. You may be lucky to have change management professionals within your organization. But without going into too much in the detail of the theories behind it, essentially, I'd like to talk to you about the 4 principles that Mr. Kotter lays out in this book. So they are select few, diverse many, have to, want to, head and heart, and management and leadership. And I'll start with the last one. So management and leadership basically talks about that change does not just come about by effectively project managing a new initiative, but that it's about inspiring people, bringing them together with vision and a show of leadership. Head and heart says that logic alone doesn't help inspire a group of people, but you have to appeal to the human desire to contribute to something that's greater than them, right? Answer questions like, what's in it for me, or what is this in service of? Have to and want to are about giving employees kind of a stake, ownership of the change that you're making. It's creating an environment where people feel like they get to partake as opposed to have to partake. And select few and diverse many talks about the fact that change that affects many will be carried out much better if it's carried by many hearts, minds, hands and feet, over relying on a select few to bring in that change, or a new team for that matter. So to kind of get it out of the way a little bit, this kind of sounds like it was written in the 1996, doesn't it? It's a little bit like, you can imagine some manager or CEO picking this up in 1996 and go like, oh my God, if I treat people like human beings, then they're going to, respond much better to change. This is radical, But in fairness to Mr. Kotter, it's probably very much relevant for its time, but also what he's really saying is that to successfully bring about change, you should really find ways to understand the people that you're working with and to make them a part of the change that you're introducing. All right. So based on that, I've developed, or I've extracted these 3 summaries, basically, of the 4 different principles. So the first is understand your people and your organization, know the language that connects with your people or your organization, and approach change in collaboration with those very people. And so from that, I've derived 3 different roles that you can take as a designer: the navigator, the translator, and the advocate, who very handily correspond with the three different things that I just mentioned. So let's talk a bit about the navigator first. As you may have gathered, I'm a bit of a nerd, and part of that is a fascination with spaceflight and space and science fiction and all those kind of things. And so I figured, what better way to talk about a navigator than to talk about someone who's gone up in space? And so there's this gentleman here called Chris Hadfield. Chris is a retired astronaut, one of the first people to essentially do extravehicular, the first Canadian astronaut to do extravehicular activity in space. And he's written a book right when he came back from space, not in space. That would have been difficult, I imagine. But when he came back, he wrote a book on what he's learned about life on Earth, after being in space. And in that, he talks about this concept called attitude. So not necessarily attitude in the sense like, oh, you got to check your attitude, or like, you got to have a good attitude. But the attitude that talks about in spaceflight refers to orientation, which direction your vehicle is pointing in relative to the sun or of another spacecraft, right? So to position yourself, because if you imagine space, it's a vast thing, and so to know where you are, you got to have attitude. You got to know where you sit in relation to other objects. So he talks about that in relation to what he's learned about the notion of attitude and how that's his trajectory in life and all the rest of it. But it stuck with me because I feel like in order to affect change, which we've seen can be as small or as big as you'd like, really, you have to, I'm convinced that you have to know a little bit about the environment that you operate in, right? It can't just be that you're working in isolation, but you have to have that attitude of your organization, organizational attitude, if you will, which can also be organizational attitude, but that's a different thing. So essentially, that's what the navigator is all about, right? So understanding your people, your organization, and using the methods that you use as a designer for understanding people to understanding your colleagues and your company. So essentially, kind of becoming an organizational ethnographer, of course, which is, by the way, a real thing and is a much bigger practice, and I won't go into that, but it's also very interesting. For instance, all those kind of fancy maps that we make to capture all the different market forces at play with our customers and maybe their purchasing decisions, you can use those on your own colleagues. Crazy. Okay, I might be an idiot, okay? But when I first thought about these kind of things, I was like, I'd never considered that. I'd never considered using the tools that we use to develop empathy with our customers or with our users, our end users, to apply those on our colleagues to better understand my working environment, right? And it doesn't have to be these ecosystem maps that kind of like map, in this case, this is an example that I developed for a project that I was working in, which was quite complex, had like a lot of different stakeholders of different parts of the organization. And I was trying to figure out, like, okay, who relates to what? Why are certain decisions being favored over others? And by mapping something like this, that helps, right? That helps in kind of capturing all those different pieces in play. But it can be on a more detailed level, right? We heard a lot of conversations around personas and empathy today. Something as simple as that. Have conversations with your colleagues about like the things that motivate them, their pains and their gains, their objectives, the things that they say on the likes of Teams or Zoom calls. You can capture all of those things, and by doing so, you can better start understanding the people that you're working with. And it might feel a little bit unethical first, like you're like, oh, should I be capturing what my colleague Bob just said and make it part of his persona? But the thing is, right, they're tools for understanding. So they're tools for giving you, again, that sense of control over the things that otherwise feel uncontrollable. Okay, so next, the translator. So this is a holiday photo of me. I was, yeah, just, it would be weird if it was someone else, but it's me. So this is me in front of the top of a temple in Jordan, in Petra, which is this ancient city, yeah, very beautiful. This was after a fairly grueling hike of about, I want to say about 6 hours or something like that. But if you were to look at this picture and I were to tell you, like, oh, this is in Petra, this is in Jordan, just like I did just now, you'd go like, oh yeah, it's nice. Good looking temple, sands, interesting, reminds me of the beach. It's not, it's very far from the beach. But as a matter of fact, my wife, who was with me on that very same trip, one of the things that she remembers most about that is not so much the temple that we were standing in front of, but just to the right of this, there was this incredible ravine, right? This path that we just hiked up. You can see, I think, a gentleman just over here. And she remembers that view. She's like, forget about the temple. That's the view that was incredible, right? And because she enjoyed the landscape so much, that's the thing that kind of stuck with her. So this holiday photo phenomena is described by Jeff Pattern in his book User Story Mapping, and he uses that as an example to convey that when we're looking at the same artifacts, when we often say like a picture tells more than 1,000 words or something like that, but the reality is that that same picture can have different meanings to different people, right? And so when we talk about developing shared understanding about what people care about, the language that they use, then the same artifacts that we choose to present to them might actually have different meanings to different people. And so to achieve proper alignment is what Jeff is saying, not me, the other guy, is to essentially, when referencing something, you got to build towards shared understanding, and you got to, go past the artifacts. So that's what the translator is all about, right? It's about developing shared understanding and finding ways to essentially speak in the language that will resonate more with others. And the idea is that, by virtue of us all approaching things from our own perspectives, we'll kind of have different understanding of different concepts. And so you gotta kind of build on that understanding that you would do in your capacity as a navigator and start figuring out, like, okay, what's the language that does resonates with people in order for me to actually convince them of the thing that I'm trying to convince them of. You got to find ways to speak their language, become an organizational interpreter of sorts. So one of the ways that could be really handy, or that I found is really handy, is something called the Good Partner Map. This is developed by Ryan Rumsey of Second Wave Dive, a designer gone educator. He kind of offers courses on this, and there's a bit of content from those courses that I've taken as well. But it's this particularly, the Good Partner Map, I think, is a really interesting canvas, because what it does is it basically allows you to dissect what you're offering in a way that is all about value, right? So you can see it here, numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. Who is it that you're providing value for, right? So who are the different people that you're working with? What are you providing a value? How are you providing that a value? Why is this even valuable, right? Like, what are the, objectively speaking, the ways that this is valuable? And then the second half of the canvas essentially allows you to tweak the offering on the left in such a way that it can basically resonates better with the person that you're trying to sell to, right? So it's a way to experiment with language and your offering, the definition of your offering, in a way that you can experiment with, like, how can I make this more interesting for the person that I'm hoping to work with? So I use that on the project that I just mentioned earlier as a way to, capture, like, for the director of product, for instance, that I was working with, like, what are their pains and gains, and how can I think of my offerings in such a way that and present them in such a way that they are more aligned with the thing that I've learned about by mapping essentially their considerations, and how can I tweak my language in such a way that I can, speak to them in a way that resonates more. So the second tool, because if the first part, understanding, tells you more about them, right? Helps you understand what are the forces at play, who are the people, what are their pains, gains, objectives, etc. Then the Good Partner Map allows you to experiment with the language. Then the third part, if you will, is about finding ways to then convey that, tell that story about to the other person. Use the language that you've just learned or defined or refined, if you will. As designers, we have a tendency to present our work in a classical storytelling fashion, so in the top right-hand corner over there. right? So there is a problem. I went and researched it, came up with a solution, and the solution maybe wasn't great initially, and then I refined, and then it was great, and here's the solution, you know? But our partners in business, as a matter of fact, they think of this kind of decision-making as more a collection of trade-offs, right? So, and there's frameworks for that, more analytical, that are less about like, you know, I came up with something, it was great, there were problems, and all the rest of it. So that's called analytical storytelling. This is Ryan also talks about that on his both in his book and his blog, which I would recommend you check out. But essentially, they're based on the pyramid principle of Barbara Minto. So Barbara Minto is a person who is ex-McKinsey, so management consultants, and so she would have worked with like a lot of different companies that really, as a management consultant, she helped them whittle down their decision fatigue, right? Like all the different options presented before them, what management consultants are really good at is kind of helping make decisions of all the different options out there. And so she developed, based on all the work that she did, the formats that were successful with customers, she came up with the pyramid principle, which essentially distills storytelling in kind of like a really straightforward, formulaic structure, essentially. But I don't have enough time to go into that into detail, but I would recommend you check these two things out. But essentially what you can take away from this is that once you've established who you're designing for, who you're making change with, essentially, figured out language or experimented with ways to position your change in a way that resonates with that people, then the next important thing is to experiment with how to actually tell the story of what you're hoping to make as a change. So last but not least, we'll talk to the advocate. And to talk about that, I'd like to introduce you to this social startup called Common Knowledge. So Common Knowledge is an Irish startup based in the west of Ireland. And I can't remember what it's like in the US, but I know that in Ireland, for a fact, we have a bit of a housing crisis, right? So we have a lot of demand for houses. We don't have a lot of actual houses for people to buy or to rent. And so there's a lot of people that are essentially unable to make that change in their lives. And so what Common Knowledge does is they've started this essentially educational center that they say, like, over the years we've lost our common knowledge of building, repairing things. And so what they do is they offer courses in doing basic construction, basic DIY and stuff like that. And in ways that allow you to take on the challenge of, building and renovating a property yourself, or maybe with more resources than you would have had otherwise, right? So it's a really interesting thing. But what they've done in particular with that initiative is they've kind of lowered the barrier for people to purchase a property, to get a home, to find, move on with their lives essentially from being renters or living with their parents or otherwise. And it's that notion of, breaking down barriers, making more inclusive, lowering the threshold for people. That's essentially what the advocate is all about. Because the notion is that what we've seen is for change to be successfully integrated, that it needs to be approached together, then you got to make inclusive environments for people to actually be able to step into that, right? So if you're asking for people to do more research, you can't just tell them, like, go do research, You got to actually empower them with the tools to allow them to do that. So you essentially have to become a community builder. Examples of that are, for instance, some of the things that are done by the likes of IBM. IBM Design Thinking is a very, very famous example. Essentially hired an army of designers and steered about a 300,000 people large organization to become more design centers by this educational program. But then also GE, who was less successful in the similar output, but rather than using design thinking, an educational design thinking program, they used a design system called Predix as a way to bring about change and user-centered design across the organization. But your version of this doesn't have to be quite as big, right? So we've just heard Dua talk about like playbooks and stuff like that, and templates and all those things to empower people in the organization to do the same. We're approaching something similar, right, from a more humble place of only getting started with this. But first of all, it's very well written by my colleague Colleen, very compact, but it's also just written in Word, It's a Word document on a SharePoint file where most of our colleagues live and breathe and do their daily things. Another great example of like accessible tooling is that is on the right-hand side here, where Hannah from Gov.uk, so a service designer and the UK government, essentially talks about how your tooling, so if you're making a journey map, should be written in such a way that it is accessible, right? So in this case, Google Docs. It doesn't have to be in Figma, because if we think about the change that you're trying to make, and if you're this, this person pushing this boulder up the hill, if you will, and then you don't want to be the single person pushing that boulder up the hill, right? You want to have other people around you. So like if as something as simple as introducing a journey map in a tool that people are already familiar with that they can contribute to themselves, that will make it a living and breathing document much better, rather than if it's you or your team that are the only people that are actually updating that document. So yeah, I'm at time, so I'll hurry up. Now, you hear all of this and you go like, well, Jeff, we've just established that burnout is a common thing and I'm exhausted, and you've just given me loads more work to do, so what's the story, right? What are we doing here? Well, the problem is, and 80%, this is something that my manager used to say at a previous company, 80% of software is dealing with people, building software is dealing with people, and only 20% is actually creating, right? And so if we acknowledge that as a fact, that so much of our work is to do about dealing with people, other parts in our organization, our customers, all those kind of things, then this is kind of an unfortunate reality, but that just means that we've got to reorient the way that we do our jobs in such a way that we prioritize, or that we, rather than seeing this as extra work that we shouldn't be doing, this is work that will ultimately make you more successful. So the better you are at reading your organization, the higher your acceleration rate is, if you will, of making change in your organization. Because if people understand you and trust you, and you understand them and trust them, then you achieve great things together. So the theme is that, first of all, you have all the tools you need to bring about the change that you're charged with, right? We've heard that, essentially understanding, using that empathy that we spoke about, that you use with customers on the daily. Use that. That's your superpower. We've heard about those 3 change roles: the navigator, the translator, and the advocate. Understanding your organization, speaking the language of them, and finding ways to essentially evangelizing what you do in such a way that you include them into your process. And I hope that this gives you some of the tools that give you some of that control that we were talking about earlier. Either way, I'll be rooting for you. So thanks very much.
So that's important.
All good.
So thank you. That was a great talk. I really like the aspect of change, because that's when I opened it. It was all about how do you actually implement some of these things that we're doing. So do we have any online questions? No. Any questions from the audience? Okay, we have one back there. So here's my best shot.
Ooh.
Sorry, not a good shot.
Am I the only one that thinks this should be a ball and not a box? Jeff, thanks for your talk. The thing that, this is kind of a specific question, but you highlighted a voice of customer playbook.
Mm-hmm.
That was interesting to me. Can you talk about like the content of that and what that entails specifically?
Yeah, so the voice of customer playbook is essentially written to help others in the organization do research, knowing that we can't be everywhere, right? I acknowledge that we're a 20-person team in a 20,000 people organization, and so even if you make that even to make that subset of the people that are relevant to what we're doing a little bit smaller, then that's still a lot of people that we can't service on on the daily. And so the idea about the voice of customer playbook is that it's designed in such a way that let's say a colleague in the likes of marketing can look at this and say, like, if they want to do research on a particular project, they can say, like, okay, well, what am I trying to learn? There's like a flow chart for that, essentially. What's the nature of the question? What is the the nature of what I'm hoping to learn, what is my objective, and basically this document, this playbook, helps recommend a number of different methods and processes that are specific, but that are not necessarily like specific to our industry, but that have some twist that they're relevant to our organization essentially, but are ultimately just a collection of methods and stuff that people can find online, right? Something like the Nielsen Norman or whatever. So it's essentially an accelerator document that will help people figure out where to start. We're kind of hoping and building on that by also essentially providing a like a repository of all different projects. So if someone's interested in understanding, oh, I'd like to do this type of research, then we can offer like, oh, we've done these types of projects already. So here's some examples of how we've approached that ourselves as inspiration for how you might do that. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Cool.
Any other questions? We have one right at the front here. So the box is coming its way.
Where am I throwing this? Okay.
Right to the front.
If I can get it.
Thank you so much for the great talk. It was very inspirational knowing that I'm also coming from the enterprise sort of design kind of organization. My question might sound a bit I don't know, too broad, but I'll try. So I guess in your organization, how do you ritualize sort of the changes well done, as well as like define and celebrate when things are done well, and also kind of the lessons learned if, let's say, things didn't go as well as you had anticipated?
Yeah, so every project, because we are kind of fortunate in a way that we're coming at this, Charles River is a 75-year-old company, right? And part of the challenge that we have is that we also operate in an industry that's heavily paper-based, heavily traditional, and so we're very lucky in the sense that we're coming at this with fresh perspective, and so every project that we start, we're not necessarily just stumbling into that, like, oh, we need to do this, but we're kind of setting it up for success, right? So at the start of every project, there is like metrics that need to be defined, like, what are we hoping to achieve? And so specifically on a project level, we kind of have that well documented, if you will. So then at the end of a major milestone, if it's like a particular project release or whatever, we're able to assess like, oh, did we do our jobs? Yes or no? And there's been projects that have been successful and projects that have been less successful, and that's the nature of transformations. Like some go well and some you just learn and move on. And so when they do go well, then obviously some of the ways that we celebrate those wins is by kind of talking about that in a broad, celebrating those, broadcasting those to the larger company to say like, hey, we did this, we made this change, here's what we learned from it, there's basically to make it known to other parts of the organization, especially in such a large company, that A, we have the capacity to do this in-house, we don't have to go to external vendors to do that anymore, and you might get something cool out of it, so come do it as well. So hope that answers your question. Yeah, cool.
Brilliant. I think that brings us to time, so thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Thanks all.
I can just bring that off with you.